History rarely begins with a whisper, but this one begins with a gasp. Imagine a teenage boy crowned as the spiritual ruler of Christendom, draped in sacred vestments while Rome itself held its breath. Behind the incense and marble, behind prayers spoken in Latin and vows of holiness, there simmered stories of sex, violence, excess, and power so extreme that even hardened medieval chroniclers struggled to put them into words. This is not just the story of a pope. It is a journey into how sexuality, rumor, and authority collided at one of the darkest crossroads in European history, where the line between sin and sovereignty nearly vanished altogether. To understand why Pope John XII would later be remembered as the most corrupt pope who ever lived, you have to step into 10th century Rome, a city that barely resembled the spiritual capital imagined today. This was not a time of stability or reverence. Rome was a battleground of noble families, street violence, political assassinations, and whispered scandals. The papacy itself had become a prize to be seized, not a calling to be answered. Sexual morality, at least among the elite, was less a rule than a weapon, used to shame enemies and justify power grabs. Into this volatile world stepped Octavian, a boy born into privilege, danger, and ambition, long before he ever took the name John XII. Octavian was the son of Alberic II of Spoleto, the most powerful man in Rome, a ruler in everything but title. Alberic controlled the city with brute force and strategic marriages, installing and removing popes as if they were pieces on a board. According to later chroniclers, Alberic extracted an oath from the Roman nobility that when the papal throne fell vacant, they would elect his son. This alone tells us how far the papacy had drifted from spiritual ideals. It was no longer unthinkable that a teenage boy raised in luxury and political intrigue would be handed control of the church. When Alberic died and the promise was fulfilled, Octavian became Pope John XII at around 18 years old, possibly even younger. Medieval writers emphasize his age again and again, not just as a fact, but as an accusation. To them, youth explained indulgence. From the moment he ascended the throne, stories began to spread that the papal palace no longer echoed with prayer, but with laughter, music, and illicit encounters. One chronicler would later claim that the Lateran Palace had become a place of constant sexual activity, though even sympathetic historians caution that such claims came from enemies eager to tear him down. Still, the sheer volume of accusations is impossible to ignore. Sexual excess was not merely gossip in this era. It was a political language. To accuse a pope of sexual immorality was to undermine his divine authority. And yet, with John XII, the accusations grew more graphic and persistent than usual. He was said to take lovers openly, including married women and widows, acts that horrified even a society accustomed to clerical hypocrisy. Some sources, written decades later, went further, accusing him of incest and sacrilege, claiming he violated virgins within the walls of sacred buildings. Modern historians approach these accounts with caution, but they agree on one thing: John XII made no serious effort to appear morally upright, and that alone was scandal enough. What makes his story particularly unsettling is how sexuality, violence, and sacred power intertwine. This was not a pope quietly bending rules in private. According to hostile accounts, John XII lived like a feudal warlord, riding out with armed companions, participating in hunts and reveling in blood sports. The idea of a pope spilling blood was deeply offensive to contemporaries, and it fed into the perception that he had abandoned his spiritual role entirely. Some legends even claimed he toasted pagan gods while gambling. A detail historians suspect was exaggerated to portray him as anti-Christian rather than merely immoral. Still, such stories reveal how shocking his behavior appeared to those watching from the outside. At the same time, John XII was not merely indulging himself. He was playing a dangerous political game. Rome was surrounded by rival powers, and the papacy needed protection. This led him to crown Otto, the First of Germany, as Holy Roman Emperor, a move that would come back to haunt him. At first, the alliance seemed practical. Otto offered military support, and John gained a powerful patron. But alliances built on convenience rarely last, especially when trust is thin and rumors of sexual scandal circulate like wildfire. As John's reputation worsened, so did his relationship with Otto. Chroniclers loyal to the emperor began documenting the Pope's alleged crimes in astonishing detail. They accused him of ordaining bishops in exchange for sexual favors, of blinding enemies, of murder, and of turning sacred spaces into sites of pleasure. Whether all these accusations were true is still debated, but their existence shows how sex was weaponized against him. In a world where divine favor justified power, sexual corruption became proof of unfitness to rule. One of the most enduring legends claims that John XII died during a sexual encounter, struck down by a jealous husband or divine judgment itself. This story appears in later sources and reads almost too perfectly, as if crafted to serve as moral punishment. Many historians now believe it is more symbolic than factual, yet its persistence speaks volumes. Medieval audiences wanted his life to end the way it was rumored to be lived, in scandal. The legend turned his death into a cautionary tale, reinforcing the idea that sexual excess would inevitably lead to ruin. What is striking, however, is how John XII's story reveals more about medieval anxieties around sex than about sex itself. The papacy represented spiritual purity, and any deviation felt catastrophic. His alleged behavior horrified, not because no one else indulged in similar acts, but because he did so openly, without shame, and from the highest possible office. In a sense, he forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth, that sacred power did not automatically produce sacred behavior. As whispers turned into formal accusations, a synod was convened under Otto's authority. The charges read like a catalogue of every imaginable vice, sexual and otherwise. Adultery, incest, perjury, murder, sacrilege. Even contemporaries may have recognized that not all could be proven, yet the sheer number was enough to justify action. John fled Rome rather than face judgment, an act that further damaged his credibility. His absence spoke louder than any defense he might have offered. Yet even here the story refuses to be simple. When Otto left the city, John returned, reclaiming his throne and punishing his enemies with brutal efficiency. This back-and-forth power struggle underscores a crucial point. John XII was not simply a victim of slander, nor was he merely a cartoon villain of excess. He was a product of a system that rewarded ruthlessness and tolerated vice as long as it served political ends. Sex, in this context, was both pleasure and propaganda. As this chapter of his life closes, we are left with an unsettling image. A young man raised to rule a holy institution without preparation, restraint, or accountability, in a world where rumor could be as lethal as a sword. Whether every shocking detail was true almost becomes secondary. What mattered was that people believed them, repeated them, and used them to reshape the papacy itself. And as the echoes of scandal linger, the question deepens rather than fades. Was Pope John XII truly the most corrupt pope ever, or was he simply the one whose private life collided most violently with public expectation? In the next part of this story, the myths will grow darker, the politics bloodier, and the boundary between legend and reality even harder to see. When John XII reclaimed Rome after Otto's departure, the city learned just how thin the line was between scandal and survival. Those who had testified against him or benefited from his temporary fall were suddenly exposed. Several were mutilated or exiled, punishments that horrified observers and reinforced the idea that this pope ruled more like a prince than a pastor. Sexual rumor had weakened his authority, but raw violence restored it, at least for a time. In the medieval imagination, this combination was deeply unsettling. A pope was supposed to conquer sin, not embody it with both desire and cruelty. What followed was a period of uneasy calm, during which stories about John XII only multiplied. Some were whispered by monks copying manuscripts in distant abbeys, others by Roman nobles who had survived his wrath. They spoke of nights that blurred into mornings inside the Lateran palace, of banquets that lasted for days, of singers, dancers, and lovers moving freely through spaces once reserved for prayer. Modern historians are careful to note that such descriptions resemble stock tropes used to describe corrupt rulers. Yet the consistency of these tales across regions suggests something more than pure invention. At the very least, John did nothing to counter them. Sexuality in this era was not private in the way we understand it today. The behavior of elites was public currency, shaping alliances and enmities. A pope who openly kept mistresses sent a signal that he rejected restraint as a virtue. Some accounts claim that John rewarded loyal followers by arranging marriages or affairs, using intimacy as a political tool. Whether literal or metaphorical, these stories reveal how sex and power were imagined as intertwined. To rule was to possess, and to possess was to demonstrate dominance. It was during this time that the most extreme accusations began to appear in writing. Chroniclers hostile to John accused him of invoking pagan gods during games of dice, of swearing oaths to Jupiter and Venus, a detail that reads almost too perfectly designed to shock Christian readers. Most historians believe these claims were symbolic, meant to portray him as spiritually alien rather than literally pagan. Yet they endure because they express a deeper fear that the Pope had abandoned not just morality, but Christianity itself. The synod convened earlier by Otto had already listed an astonishing catalogue of crimes, many sexual in nature. What matters is not whether each charge can be proven, but that such a document existed at all. It shows that sexuality had become central to evaluating John's fitness to rule. Murder and political betrayal were almost expected of powerful men. Sexual transgression was what truly delegitimized him. This tells us more about medieval values than about John alone. As rumors spread, so did legends. One popular story claimed that John kept a book cataloging his lovers, an idea that has no solid evidence, but appears in later moralizing texts. Another suggested he believed himself protected by divine favor, no matter his actions, a claim that framed his sexuality as hubris rather than appetite. These legends served as cautionary tales, warning future generations of what happened when sacred authority went unchecked. Yet amid the scandal, John continued to perform official duties. He issued charters, appointed bishops, and corresponded with foreign rulers. This contradiction is crucial. He was not an absentee pope lost entirely to indulgence. He governed, negotiated, and fought to maintain papal independence. This duality frustrates any simple narrative. He was capable of both administrative competence and personal excess, a combination that made him unpredictable and dangerous. The tension between John and Otto eventually reignited. Otto returned to Italy, determined to reassert control and reform the papacy. Faced with imperial pressure once more, John fled again, this time to the countryside. His flight was interpreted as guilt by his enemies, proof that the stories were true. In his absence, a new pope was installed, deepening the sense that the papacy had become a political football. Sexual scandal provided the justification, but power was the real prize. When John returned yet again, the cycle repeated: punishment, fear, and silence. But something had changed. The aura of invincibility was gone. Even those who benefited from his rule sensed that his position was fragile. The rumors that once titillated now threatened to consume him. In medieval thought, repeated scandal suggested divine displeasure. The idea that God would eventually intervene gained traction, setting the stage for the most famous legend of all. According to later accounts, John XII died suddenly in 964. The circumstances are unclear, and this uncertainty gave rise to one of the most enduring stories in papal history. Some chroniclers claimed he was struck by paralysis during a sexual encounter, others that he was murdered by an outraged husband. Modern scholars treat these tales with skepticism, noting the lack of contemporary corroboration. Still, the legend persisted because it felt narratively satisfying. A pope defined by sexual scandal met an end shaped by sex. Whether true or not, this story cemented John's reputation for centuries. He became a symbol rather than a man, an example cited whenever critics wanted to argue that the Church had strayed from its ideals. His name was invoked in debates about clerical celibacy, corruption, and reform. In this way, his alleged sexuality continued to shape history long after his death. But to stop here would be to miss the deeper significance of his life. John XII's story is not only about excess, it is about how societies use sex to explain power. His enemies exaggerated his vices to justify control, while his supporters ignored them to preserve autonomy. Truth was less important than usefulness. Sexual rumor became a language everyone understood, a shorthand for moral failure that required no further proof. As the dust settled and the papacy moved on, the memory of John XII lingered like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. He became the benchmark against which later corrupt popes were measured, often unfairly. Every whispered affair, every accusation of indulgence echoed back to his reign. In that sense, his legacy shaped the Church's relationship with sexuality for generations. And yet, one question remains unresolved, hanging between history and legend. Was John XII uniquely depraved, or was he simply the first pope whose private life became public spectacle on such a scale? As we move deeper into the shadows of his story, the answer becomes less certain, and the myths more revealing than the facts themselves. As centuries passed, the figure of John XII drifted further from the flesh and blood teenager who once ruled Rome and closer to a symbol shaped by fear, fascination, and moral anxiety. Medieval writers returned to his story again and again. each retelling sharpening the edges, darkening the shadows, and amplifying the sexual themes that had already defined his reputation. In monasteries where celibacy was preached as the highest virtue, John became a convenient warning, a living proof of what happened when desire went unchecked by discipline. His life was less a biography than a mirror reflecting what the Church most feared about itself. Later chroniclers, writing generations after his death, began to layer his story with details that blurred the boundary between rumor and morality play. Some claimed he held mock ceremonies that parodied sacred rites, replacing prayers with crude jokes and turning confession into spectacle. These stories almost certainly belong to the realm of legend rather than verifiable history, but they reveal how deeply his name had become associated with sexual and spiritual inversion. In these accounts, John was no longer merely immoral. He was the anti-pope, a figure who inverted holiness itself. What makes these legends so powerful is not their accuracy, but their function. They allowed writers to externalize corruption, to locate it safely in the past and in one individual. By concentrating so much scandal in John XII, later generations could imagine that the Church had learned its lesson, even as similar behaviors continued in quieter forms. Sex, after all, never disappeared from the papacy. It simply became more discreet. John's great crime, in the eyes of history, may have been not indulgence, but visibility. As scholarship developed in the modern era, historians began peeling back the layers of accusation. They compared hostile sources with administrative records, noting inconsistencies and political motivations. They pointed out that many of the most lurid claims came from writers aligned with auto or later reform movements eager to justify imperial intervention. This does not mean John was innocent or even restrained, but it complicates the image of him as uniquely monstrous. In a violent, sexually permissive, aristocratic culture, his behavior may have been extreme, but not entirely anomalous. Still, even revisionist historians concede that John XII crossed lines others at least pretended not to see. He did not cloak his appetites in piety or apology. He lived as if the papacy were his inheritance rather than his burden. That attitude alone would have been enough to provoke outrage, even without the more sensational allegations. Sexuality, in his case, became the most visible expression of contempt for expectations. Over time, his story took on new meanings. During debates about clerical celibacy in later centuries, John was invoked as evidence that vows alone could not restrain desire. Reformers held him up as proof that institutional power without accountability led inevitably to abuse. Even critics outside the Church found in him a ready-made symbol, a way to argue that moral authority and sexual behavior were often at odds. Each retelling said as much about the storyteller as about John himself. What often gets lost is the human dimension. John XII was likely raised without limits, groomed for power rather than introspection. He inherited enemies along with authority, and learned early that fear could be more effective than respect. In such an environment, sexuality could easily become another assertion of dominance, another way to remind others who ruled. Whether he sought pleasure, control, or simply escape is something history cannot answer, but the question itself humanizes a figure long reduced to caricature. By the time Renaissance popes would openly acknowledge their children or commission erotic art, John XII had already become a cautionary ancestor. His excesses, real or imagined, haunted the institution, shaping how later popes managed their private lives. Silence replaced openness, secrecy replaced spectacle. In that sense, John's legacy was not only scandal but strategy. He taught the Church what not to reveal. As we look back now, stripped of medieval moral panic, but still fascinated by the collision of sex and sanctity, John XII remains compelling because he forces uncomfortable questions. Can any institution built on ideals survive contact with human desire? Does power magnify appetite or merely expose it? And why are we so eager to believe the worst about those who claim moral authority? His story endures not because it is uniquely shocking, but because the rumors, legends, and accusations surrounding him tell us as much about collective imagination as they do about 10th century Rome. They reveal how sexuality has always been used to define virtue and vice, legitimacy and corruption. As this story draws toward its end, it leaves us not with certainty, but with reflection. Pope John XII may or may not have been the most corrupt pope ever, but he was undeniably one of the most talked about, precisely because his life exposed what many preferred to keep hidden. His legend invites us to question how history is written, whose voices shape it, and why sex remains such a powerful lens through which we judge the past. If there is one thing John XII teaches us, it is that scandal never exists in a vacuum. It feeds on fear, fascination, and the human hunger for stories that explain power through desire. And perhaps that is why, more than 1,000 years later, his name still provokes shock, curiosity, and debate. As you think back on everything you've heard, consider which detail surprised you the most, whether it was the age at which he became pope, the rumors that followed him, or how much of his story lives somewhere between fact and legend. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring the hidden history of sex power and taboo across time, make sure to subscribe for more stories that history books often whisper, but rarely say out loud.